So my name is Josh Morden. I am the IT manager for Fred Rogers Productions up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I'm here today to talk to you about Hyper-V. So we're going to be covering some of the basics of it, how to get it all set up, build some VMs, manage them, some simple things like that. We'll cover a few PowerShell commands, just very simple stuff, and then have some time for questions at the end. So before we get started, just a show of hands, how many people here have currently using or have used Hyper-V in your environment? Wow, that's a lot. Okay. How many people are using another platform like VMware? Okay. And how many people are not doing any kind of virtualization at all? Okay, great. A very diverse crowd. So yeah, hopefully we're going to cover some of the basics today, and hopefully by the time we're finished here, you'll have some skills to go and maybe start playing around with Hyper-V and see if maybe it's a fit for your organization. So before we get started, just because a lot of people like to ask when they see where I work, just a little bit about the company. Fred Rogers Productions is a children's television production company. I imagine that probably most of you in this room are familiar with at least one of the products that we have up here. I mean, mainly Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. That was the show we made growing up in the 70s. And if any of you have children under the age of 10, you're probably familiar with at least one of these other programs that we have. Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood is our biggest program. It's a sequel to Mr. Rogers, doing really well in PBS, ranks #1 in PBS Kids ranking, so we're very pleased with that. Our company has been using Hyper-V for 3 years. We're actually a mixed environment. We have Hyper-V, we've been using that for since 2016, and we started using VMware because there's some other software programs that work better with that platform. So we're kind of like in this mixed environment, and we'll see where that goes. But doing Hyper-V for 3 years, I've been using Hyper-V for about 5 years, just other places and in my little home lab that I have set up at home. So yeah, that's my background and our background on that. So today we're going to, just an overview, we're going to talk about just very basics of what is virtualization. We'll get into a little bit of Hyper-V, and then we'll actually go to a live demo. So I only have about like less than 20 slides here, and then most of the presentation today is going to be live demo on how to do installation and configuring of the Hyper-V itself, managing the VMs, and then we'll have some time for Q&A afterwards. So virtualization. What is virtualization? Well, I think most of you are here. It looks like we're already using some virtualization platform, so you're probably familiar. But for those of you who may not be, the way to think of virtualization is, in a very high-level view, is saying that instead of running, let's say, 10 physical servers, I'm going to take 1 or 2 really powerful servers and run virtualized instances of those 10. It's similar to, you think about your desktop computer, you're running applications, a browser, Microsoft Office, whatever, and the operating system is managing the resources, CPU, RAM, to make sure that all those programs are getting what they need. It's kind of a similar idea with when we're talking about virtualization, where we have different virtual machines, and the hypervisor is making sure that they all get the resources they need. So there's 2 types of virtualization, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is what Hyper-V is, or VMware, and basically you've got, so here's the hardware, we call it bare metal, so this is your server itself, and it's running a type 1 hypervisor. And that hypervisor is running virtual machines, so I've got 3 of them, and each of these virtual machines has its operating system and the applications that are running. Okay, pretty simple. The other type is type 2 hypervisor, and so this basically is, we've got our server, it's running an operating system, we'll say Windows in this case, and that operating system is running various applications, one of which is a type 2 hypervisor, which then is running our virtual machines. Between these 2 types, which one do you guys think is the fastest and the most efficient? Type 1. Yeah, type 1. Right. It's got, the hypervisor has direct access to the hardware. It's not going through this operating system, and your performance is going to be better. So Type 1 is Hyper-V, VMware. Type 2, which we're not going to cover today, that's more of like for workstations. So if you're using a Mac and you have Parallels, for instance, because you have some sort of Windows application that you want to run that doesn't natively work with Mac OS. Type 2 Hypervisor allows you to have that capability. But Type 1 is what Hyper-V is, and that's what we'll be covering today. So benefits of virtualization. It comes down to ease of management. It's easier to back up and restore things. What I'll show you later, basically, a virtual machine, in essence, consists of, in its bare bones configuration, just two files. There's a virtual machine file that has the config for that VM, and then a hard disk file, so like a VHD or a VHDX, that is the hard disk for that virtual machine. So when I'm doing backups, it's really simple. I can just move the files around. If I'm doing high availability, which is if I have two hosts and I want to have, let's say I'm doing some maintenance on one host and I don't want to shut all those virtual machines down, I can move those live migration to another host without shutting down the virtual machines. So there's no downtime and I can work on the host one by one. You also can have you have the replicated so that if something happens to one site, you don't have downtime either. So it's just very, very flexible. The other benefit is snapshots. So and we'll talk about this. V actually calls it checkpoints. And what this allows you to do is if you've ever played, this is kind of a bad example, but if you've ever played emulators like Nintendo emulators or Game Boy, you know that there's like a save function inside the emulator that kind of makes a snapshot in time, and then you can go back and kind of reload that position. It's not quite exactly what's happening here, but it's a similar kind of idea when we're taking snapshots. So if I'm doing some updates and I'm concerned I might break something, I can take a snapshot for that. And lastly, there's some physical benefits. Obviously, lower power consumption. I'm running one or two physical boxes as opposed to a whole bunch of them. And that also means less rack space. So using our 10 server example, instead of taking 50U or whatever it is, that's all condensed down to 4U if I'm doing two U hosts. A lot of benefits with the virtualization. All right, so installing and configuring Hyper-V. So just briefly, Hyper-V, what is it? It was released on June 26, 2008, originally with a Windows Server 2008. And since then, it's gone through a lot of changes and a lot of improvements as Microsoft was kind of playing catch up because VMware was the king in this space. And so over time, Microsoft's been done a pretty good job, I think, in making it a more viable player in this field. It is available in two formats, either as a role for Windows Server or as a free standalone Hyper-V server. So you can actually go to the Microsoft download page and you can download Hyper-V Server 2016 or 2019. And it's basically a stripped down version of Windows Server that just has everything it needs just to run Hyper-V. And it's free. So those are your options. So hardware requirements, these are the official requirements from Microsoft, 64-bit. BIOS needs to support virtualization. Pretty much any computer you buy today supports this, so that's not really an issue like it would have been maybe 15 years ago. I'm not sure why Microsoft says this, but they say the minimum is 4 gigs. You really don't want to use 4 gigs. If you had that, you probably could run maybe 1 or 2 servers in server core mode. My recommendation is to do 16 gigs at least, and recommended a 32 gig minimum. Of course, this depends on your environment and how many servers you're running. Just as point of reference, if we're talking about like the bare minimum, I have a Hyper-V host at home. That is 16 gigs of RAM. I've got 5 VMs on there, 3 Windows servers, 1 Windows 8 VM I use for testing, and then a free PBX. And it runs fine, but I probably won't want to throw a lot more at it. So that gives you an idea if you're talking about very, bare minimum, what's the lowest RAM I could get with. I would say 16, but at least go with 32, and a bigger environment, 64 would be also. You want to have a RAID array, obviously. RAID 10 if you can afford it. Have two partitions. So you want one for the Hyper-V itself, and then another partition for the VMs. You don't want to put VMs on the same pool that you have your Hyper-V itself, because you'll get performance issues. So if you're using a SAN to store your VMs, then this is a moot point. But if you're talking about like DAS storage, then separate those out. Okay, so setup process. This is important to keep in mind about the two different types of Hyper-V. Hyper-V server, so 2016, but I think 2018 is now out. It is free, however, it is CLI only, so you need to use PowerShell to do maintenance. There is no GUI. Now, if you connect it to a domain, like what we do at Fred Rogers Productions, then you can use the Hyper-V management tools on your workstation to connect in. And that actually is the way that Microsoft has been pushing people towards. They want everybody to run server core and use the RSAT tools, remote server administration tools, on your workstation to administer servers. So they're kind of trying to, that's probably part of the reason why they have it CLI only. And the other method is server role. And so this would be installed the same way you'd install any server role on your computer. You just go to Server Manager, add remove features, select Hyper-V, and follow the wizard from there. Let's see, let's go next. There we go. Okay. So here's the setup process. This is my way of doing it, and you want to do the process in this order. So when you first spin up or make your Hyper-V server, you want to configure a static IP address, obviously as with any server, and then you want to rename it, and then it's going to restart, and then you join the domain. I like to do the static IP and the server name first, so then when we connect to the domain and it's registered in Active Directory and DNS, everything's fine, and I mean, you can change it, but I just find it cleaner just to, get that set up first. Now, if you are using the free Hyper-V server, there is if you type, you log in and then you type sconfig and you get an interactive text-based menu. And if you go to to join a domain through that interface, it actually will prompt you afterwards and say, would you like to rename the computer before rebooting? So that's it can save you if you're doing the Hyper-V server. Okay, and then finally, you just want to configure your virtual switches. We'll talk a little bit about that. Basically, you want to have one NIC that's for management, and then other NICs that are for the VMs themselves. Okay. All right, so as I mentioned, there's two ways of managing VMs. The first is this Hyper-V Manager, which we're going to do. And then there's, of course, this PowerShell. We'll cover a few examples of that. All right, and that's it for my PowerPoint. So we're going to move on to the live demo. Okay, so this is the Hyper-V Manager. And trying to face my live here. Okay, so this part here gives you the lists of all of the hosts. So if I'm doing a single host, this top one here is just my computer name. But if you were setting up additional Hyper-V hosts, you could add them, and then they'd be all listed here. This part here has all the virtual machines. We have a section for if there are any. Let me see. Let me see if I put the antenna out here. Maybe it'll stop cutting out. There's checkpoints for the virtual machines, and then down here we have just some summary information. On this side, we have some options for Hyper-V itself, and if I've clicked on a virtual machine, then I will also see options related to that virtual machine. Okay, so let's go through the process of Oh, actually, no, I'm sorry. First things first, before we start making virtual machines, we have to actually create a switch. So in this process, first thing I would do is click, you would go to New Virtual Network Switch, hit External, and Create. And then we give it a name. So let's say I'm making management. I'll call this management. I will go down here and select which NIC I want to use. And then what you want to do is this checkbox here, allow management operating system to share this network adapter. So this will allow your Hyper-V to, if you're remoting in to do work, this particular switch here will allow you to do that. And if you are using management VLANs in your environment, then you check this and enter it. So let's say I was 10, for example, for management. Just a little caveat here. If you're working on this via RDP, be careful about unchecking this. Because if you uncheck this, let's say I'm creating I've created my management switch and I want to make let's say I call them corporate, that I'm going to use just for the VMs. And then I go to uncheck this because I'm like, well, I just want these switches to now be for the VMs and not for the host. And if you uncheck this and you don't have any other switches that are connected to management, you will lose your connection to Hyper-V and will have to go and terminal in physically to the server itself. So make sure that you have your management switch created first. That's the reason why I like to do that first, and then create your corporate NICs so that you make sure you're not locked out. All right, I'm not going to actually hit apply because I don't want to ruin my setup here in the demo. But with that done, now we're going to go and create some VMs. So the first way to do that is from scratch. We'll just go to New Virtual Machine, go down and click Next, and we'll give it a name. So I'll call this maybe Spice World Demo. And then what I'm going to do is click this checkbox, and I'm going to select a location to store this VM. Now, because I'm doing this on a laptop, all I have is one hard disk. But if you were doing this on a production server, you'd want to have, if you're using DAS storage, you want to make sure you have another drive. If you're using a SAN, then you'd have that be the storage where you would put your VMs. But this is a demo, so I have my VM folder sitting on the same drive as Hyper-V and drive C. What I like to do is create a folder called Virtual Machines, and then in here I'm going to have folders for every machine that I'm creating. So I'm going to go ahead and select this. Now, so here's the location, C Virtual Machines. What Hyper-V is going to do is create another folder inside of Virtual Machines with the same name that I am giving my server. So in this case, this server is called Spice World Demo. So there's going to be another folder created in there called Spice World Demo. All right, now here's an important part. We have the option here to choose Generation 1 or Generation 2. If you are installing Windows Server, I would say at least 2012 and newer, you want to select Generation 2. It's got some additional features that work better with 64-bit operating system, or specifically Windows operating systems. It's UEFI based instead of BIOS, so it works better to do it this way. Generation 1 is like the old way that Hyper-V used to do it, and I would only choose that if you were doing things like installing a Linux virtual machine. Typically the recommendation is to do Generation 1. But we're installing Server 2016, so I will choose Generation 2. And now we're going to assign the memory. So typically I'll this is fine. This is, by default, they're giving it a gig. Of course, you have to take into consideration how much RAM you have on your actual physical host. If I have a 64 gig host, and I put 128 gigs here, that's not going to work. So 1 gig's fine. But here's an important feature: this use dynamic memory for this virtual machine. So kind of in the really, really old days of virtualization, what we would do is I would build my virtual machine and I'd assign it a piece of the RAM on my host. So let's say I was giving it 4 gigs. So it has that 4 gigs, it owns that, and regardless of what's happening. But servers and computers are not always using the full memory. Depending on what's going on, sometimes it's using less, sometimes it's using more. And so if I assign a permanent block of memory to that machine, it could potentially be wasting that memory that could go to other places that need it more. So what dynamic memory allows us to do is that says that we're going to give it the startup amount of 1 gig, but depending on what the needs of that virtual machine are, if it needs less maybe or it needs more, Hyper-V will increase or decrease that amount of memory that is given to that virtual machine. So it allows you to be a little bit more economical. Now there is a trade-off with that, and that is with performance. There is a performance hit. So typically Microsoft doesn't recommend using this feature if you are running servers that are very high speed requirements. So for example, SQL. You wouldn't want to do this on a SQL server or other servers where you're really concerned about every last drop of speed. So I'm going to leave it as a gig. That's fine. All right, now we're going to go choose our switch. So I'll just choose default switch. That's what I have. And now we are going to create our virtual hard disk. Now, you'll see what it's done is, because I called our server Spiceable Demo, it's created the name. It also has given us a location. So you see, remember I said before, Hyper-V would create a folder with the server name under virtual machine. So here it is. And then underneath that, there's going to be another folder called virtual hard disks, where this will sit. Now I'll show you when it's done. But what you're going to get in Hyper-V is you're going to get the server virtual machine folder, and then underneath that you're going to have folders called virtual machines and virtual hard disks. So that's how it splits up the files. So here we got hard disks. We can specify storage. Now by default, Hyper-V 2016 creates what's called a VHDX. So it's a dynamically expanding disk. So it works similar to that memory that I showed earlier. What it's going to do is, if I say 127 gigs, it's going to create a very small hard disk file. And as we start to add things to it, it's going to grow and get bigger. So why would you want to do this? One good example is, let's say that I'm building out some machines and I know that I'm going to need, let's say, for example, a terabyte's worth of storage, but I don't have a terabyte's worth of storage at the moment. It's on order. We're going to be, that's on the pipeline to get that added, but I don't have that now. What I can do is I can put the amount that I will have in the future here, and Hyper-V will say, okay, that's fine, and then we can move along. You just want to make sure that by the time you get to the point where you have that much storage, that you actually have the physical hard disks that you need for that. But this is a nice feature. It allows you to kind of, plan ahead and without having to, repartition and resize. Okay, so I'm fine with this. We're going to go ahead and click Next. Excuse me. All right, now we can choose to install the operating system. We could do it later and just manually do it. Or we have a couple options. You can use an ISO file, or you could use like a network. If you're using Windows deployment services or some sort of PXE booting, you could do it that way. Personally, what I like to do is just make a folder on the host itself called ISOs and put all of my ISOs in there. That's just my personal preference. So I'm going to do that here. We'll select this, go to Browse, and here's my ISOs folder. I will select the Windows Server 2016 ISO and hit Next. And so now we come here and we can kind of verify our results. That all looks good. And I'm going to click Finish. And now it makes it. All right. Now the last thing we want to do before we actually turn this thing on is right-click here and go down to Settings. And there's a couple things we want to do. First, we want to go to the memory. Now remember, we configured this as a dynamic memory. You'll see here, these are the ranges. So we have a minimum of 512 megabytes. And by default, it gives us this insane number. So what we're going to do is I'm going to change that because I only have, I think, 16 gigs on here. So we'll say, I don't know, 496. That'll be 4 gigs. And we can also choose here under memory buffer if I want to tell Hyper-V, try if you can to save, this percentage of my RAM so that it's available as needs start to change across all of my virtual machines. And then down here you can choose memory weight, and this is, it's kind of like if in Task Manager you can choose the CPU priority for processes. Similar kind of idea here. You can choose if things get really, really busy on the host, you can have Hyper-V prioritize things. Next thing you want to do is go to Processor. Now, here it gives you one virtual processor. So it's not the correct way of saying it, but it's sort of like, think of it as processor cores. So if I hit this maybe to 2, it's kind of like giving it 2 processor cores. Now, you don't want to put a number here that is higher than the physical cores that you actually have on your server. So you see here I've selected 2, and if you go down to here, percent of total system resources, this is at 50, because this laptop here is a 4-core computer. So by putting 2 in there, it's at 50%. If I increase this to 4, they'll be using 4% or 100% of the system resources. Now, what this is not doing is locking cores to a VM. So we're not saying like, so you don't have to be like, let's say if I have 2 VMs and I have 4 cores, and I have to be like, okay, well, I have to give 2 cores to this VM, and then I only have 2 left to give to another one. It doesn't really work that way. As you have a lot of different VMs running and Hyper-V is kind of managing these things, it can sort through that. But the best practice here is you want to not put more than what you have. And there's a formula Microsoft has on their website for how to calculate that. Typically what I do is I find that 2 is good enough if I'm doing a server that's just doing some simple things. If I was doing something more high demanding like SQL, maybe I'd give it 4. But most servers you buy today are going to be having many more cores than my laptop, which has 4. So 2 or 4 is a good place to try. And it's just trial and error. Configure it a certain way, spin it up. If you're not getting the performance that you need, you can always go back and change it. And that's the nice thing about virtual machines. Okay, so I've got my memory, I've got my CPU configured. I'm going to click OK, and now we're ready to turn it on. So we'll click Start. I'm going to double click this. Oh. No. Try that again. Yes. There we go. And so now we're loading Windows Server 2016 Installation Wizard on our virtual machine. And so from here we could just configure with, or continue with the setup process. All right. So that's all well and good, but what happens when your environment starts to get larger and now we're needing to make more VMs? This is a very time-consuming process, right? It's you gotta like go through the wizard, build the thing, and then you gotta go through the host setup process of Windows. So there's got to be a faster way. Now, those of you who use VMware, you know that there's a feature in VMware called templates. So I can build a virtual machine as I like it, kind of a base image, and tell VMware to save that as a template. So the next time that I go to make a server, I can just tell it to make another server based on that template. And then within seconds, I have a new virtual machine ready to go. Unfortunately, in Hyper-V, it does not have this function natively, but there is a workaround that you can do. And so I'll show you how that works. What you want to do first is go through the whole process that I've done with building your VM. What I would do is call it, like I have here, something like Server 2016 template or something like that. get it configured, installed the way you want it, and then shut it down. We're not going to use it anymore. So that is going to sit as a template, or our pretend template, because there isn't really templates in Hyper-V. So here's my template. Now here's what I was telling you about earlier. We got our virtual machine folder, hard disk folder. So here's our virtual machine files. This has all of the configuration information for the virtual machine. And then under virtual hard disks, we've got our hard disk image. So this is the hard disk file. And so this is what we're going to use as our pretend template. So the way that we do this is we're going to go to Import Virtual Machine. We're going to click Next. And then now we're going to browse to the folder where that template is sitting. So go to Virtual Machines, Template folder, and select. And then you see here it's detected that server within the folder, so that's good. All right, now here's the important part. What we need to do is choose Copy the Virtual Machine and create a new unique ID. So these top two options, so register in place, what that would do is, let's say I'm trying to restore my VMs, I've built a new host, and then I've copied all the files into a folder. And so now I just want Hyper-V to know, okay, here's where I have all of them. So I can register those in place. Restore virtual machine is the same thing as the first one, except that it's going to give me an option to choose a new location to copy those to. But what the third one does, it's going to copy the virtual machine somewhere, but it's going to create a new unique ID so that Hyper-V will see this as a new server. So it's not the same as the other as the template. So we'll go ahead and hit Next. And now we're going to choose where we want it to live. So remember we had virtual machines, and I'm just going to call this Spice World Clone. So I'm essentially making a new folder here for the name of my server. I'm going to call the server Spice World Clone. And I like to keep the checkpoint and paging files all in the same location. That's just my preference. Some people, you may have a separate folder for it. It's just purely a matter of preference. I like to keep everything all together in the same location. Now, one thing you notice, if you may remember that when we were making a new virtual machine, I only have to put C:virtual machines, and then Hyper-V will create a folder with that server name. But when you're importing, though, you have to specify the full path that it's going to live in. If you try to create a new, import this and make a new virtual machine, and you just put C virtual machines, it's going to dump all the files into your big folder. So when you're importing, you have to actually specify the full path. So that's what I have here. And now we are going to specify the location to put those hard disk files that we're importing from the template. Yep. So we'll clone virtual hard disks, okay. And now we got our summary here, so we can make sure everything looks fine, and let's go ahead and click Finish. So this will take a bit. While this is finishing, I want to show you some of the settings, additional settings in the virtual machine. So we already talked about memory and processor. So add hardware, this is where you would add more hardware components that you have connected to host. So you could add a SCSI, fiber channel, if you got a fiber channel SAN or tape drive. You can add more network adapters. So any other hardware that can be added will be listed there. Under firmware, this is kind of like the boot options in BIOS. If you're installing via ISO, make sure that DVD drive is here at the top. There is, I think, Hyper-V works like a physical machine where you can push a button and have it go select your boot options, but it happens so fast that you never would hit it. So if you're installing via ISO, make sure the DVD is first, and by default it will do that for you. We can enable secure boot. We can add more storage drives here, so hard disk or DVD. Here are the hard drive and DVD drives which we created, and so here you have the location for that folder. And under DVD drive, we have the ISO. If I was done installing Windows, I could go and select none, and this is basically the same thing as ejecting the disk on a physical drive. Under network adapter, we have the option to choose the virtual switch. We can enable VLAN settings, so let's say if this is a kind of like a PBX server and it needs to go on a VoIP VLAN, you can choose that here. You can do some bandwidth management if you want to do some quality of service there. Interesting thing here is that, so you have network adapter and then you have the switch. Now the VM doesn't care about the switch. I could go into here and let's say I've upgraded my NIC, right? I could go in here and this drop-down choose the new NIC after I've installed it and created the virtual switch. And the virtual machine isn't going to care. It's not going to see the difference because the adapter itself is the actual hardware that's attached to the virtual machine. Under virtual switch, we're just choosing where that adapter is pointing to. So you can change this without having to reinstall drivers and things like that. That's a good tip to keep in mind. We can do change the name if we want. All right, integration services. These are various things that allow it to kind of sync with the host. The only thing I want to point out here, if you are installing a domain controller, you want to uncheck time synchronization. Reason is because what this time synchronization does is it's going to sync the the RTC or virtual RTC clock of that virtual machine to the clock on the host. The problem with that is that if your host's clock is off, and then now your domain controller, virtual domain controller clock is now off sync, and all of your clients have no way of reorienting themselves to that time, you're going to have authentication issues because in Active Directory there's a certain time limit that you have to be within the same, the clocks have to be within the same period or otherwise you can't authenticate. So if you're doing a domain controller, uncheck time synchronization and then just configure the domain controller to sync with a proper time server, like one of the time servers from NIST, for example. Okay, so time synchronization. You can choose where we want our checkpoints to be stored, paging file. Okay, just a couple things I'm going to point out here. Automatic start action. So this just chooses what happens when you turn on and turn off the Hyper-V host. By default, it's going to start it if it was running, or if the VM was switched off when you rebooted the Hyper-V host, then it's just going to leave it off. So this is probably a good option just to keep, unless, if you really wanted some peace of mind that this is really critical to stay on, you could choose this in case it was accidentally turned off during maintenance for whatever reason, but this option is just fine. Now, here we have, this is what happens when you turn off the host. So by default, what it will do is save the virtual machine state. So kind of like it's similar to Hibernate, sort of. And so then the next time we turn the host on, it's going to bring back that VM from that saved point. As a best practice, which is not, because Microsoft has made improvements to Active Directory, it's not as necessary, but still is good practice to do. If you are doing domain controllers, you want to select shut down the guest operating system. In the old days, before Windows Server 2012, But what happened is if you power down the host and then it put the domain controller into a save state, and then between the time that you had turned it off and powered it back on again, if you had made any changes to Active Directory, let's say deleted a user, when you bring this one back up, now you've got a conflict because the other domain controllers, that user is gone, but now this host domain controller is trying to say that there's this user here, and then you can get some serious corruption. So typically what you want to do with domain controllers is hit shut down the guest operating system. So that's going to just shut the whole thing down. And then when you reboot the host, it'll turn it back on. If you really want to have even more granular control, you can actually just go through each virtual machine itself and power them off before rebooting the host. Starting with 2012, Microsoft has some redundancies in Active Directory to kind of prevent this. But it's just me as a best practice peace of mind for domain controllers, I like to choose the shutdown option. Okay, so that's fine, we'll leave that. All right, looks like our cloning process worked. But now we have two machines with the same name. So how do we know which one it is? Well, what you got to do is just go to Settings, go down to Hard Drive, and here it is. All right, Spice World Clone. So this I know, this one is the clone we just created. And now I'll just change the name. And I can change settings if I want. If I want to adjust those. And there it is. Now I've got my cloned server. So now I showed you how to make a VM from scratch and how to also clone one, so you can have one done very quickly. All right. Let's talk about excuse me. Let's talk about checkpoints. So here I've got this test server, and let's say that I'm doing some updates on this, and I want to take a checkpoint in time so that if the update breaks something, I can restore that. So we're just going to right-click, go down to checkpoint, and you'll see creating checkpoint. Okay, checkpoint's created, and now I have down here the checkpoint. Okay, so if then at some point in time later something went wrong and I'm like, oh, now let me roll back because something's broken, we can just click this here, go down to this bottom right corner and hit apply. Now I can choose to create another checkpoint of this and apply, or I can just say, I don't care about that, I just want to bring back the other one. So I'll just hit apply there. You'll see up here saving. It's going to shut down the VM. It has now been restored to its previous state. And I can start it back up, and we're back where we were before the problem happened. If I don't need these checkpoints anymore, I can just click that, go down to here and delete checkpoint. And now that's gone. All right. So let's cover some PowerShell, basic PowerShell, and then we'll have some time for questions. So these are just very basic commands. So remember, get help is your friend. The nice thing is that all of the commandlets that work with Hyper-V have VM as part of the commandlet. So if you wanted to find out what commands are available for you, you just do *VM*, and it's going to pull up. These are all the commandlets. Some of these are not, but these ones up here you see Hyper-V. These are all the commandlets that you can do with Hyper-V. So we'll clear that. Basic command, if I want to see all the list of VMs I have, you can do get VM. So there's the list of those. If I want to start a VM, so let's say this Spice World demo, which you see is off. And if I do get VM again, you'll see now it is running. If I want to stop the VM, I can do stop VM -name spiceworld demo. Gives you a confirmation. Yes, we want to do that. And now you'll see it is, there it is, it's off. If I go back here, if I want to restart the VM, it's the same thing. You restart VM -name. So those basic commands you can do with those. Now, I believe that's an actual shutdown. Yeah. No, that would be like the equivalent of turn off. Stop is like it's the same thing as like stop computer in PowerShell. It's going to do a orderly shutdown. Okay, so if I want to checkpoint a VM, let's see what we got here. Okay, let's say I want to do a checkpoint of spiceworld clone. Let's do checkpoint. Whoops, checkpoint VM hyphen. Sorry, I think I got to do VM name spiceworld clone. Creating checkpoint. So you can see it up here. It's making it. And now here's my checkpoint. If I want to apply that checkpoint, it's a little bit confusing. I'm sorry, we got to do something else first. Okay, so I missed the mandatory parameter. So what I usually like to do is, if you want to see just everything, just do get VM snapshot asterisk, and so it'll give us the list here. Now, if I want to restore this, what I'll do is just highlight this here. This is the whole name of the snapshot, and then I can do my command get restore VM snapshot, and you specify the VM name. Spiceworld clone, and then the name. Uh-oh, what did I do wrong? Oh, yeah. All right, let's do this here. Move that up here. Do you want to restore? Yes, we do. And now it goes through the process. And we can see it here, applying checkpoint succeeded in Hyper-V Manager. And now that is restored. If I want to delete it, same process. Oops. All right. What did I miss here? Oh. There we go. So that's removed. If I go up here, now the checkpoint's gone. So that's just a very basic managing it with the VMs, doing things with checkpoints. If you're working on the Hyper-V server, the free one, you'll have to use PowerShell to do all of your commands. But as I said, if you connect your free Hyper-V server to the Windows domain, you can install the Hyper-V Manager on your workstation, and then you wouldn't have to worry with doing PowerShell. You could just go up here to the top, connect a server, and then enter the name of that Hyper-V server, and then you're good to go. I actually, this is how I manage the free Hyper-V server at work. I rarely RDP into the Hyper-V server itself, except sometimes to do updates. We have a script that can handle that, but sometimes there's occasions when I'll want to RDP in and kind of make sure that goes right. But as far as managing, this is what I work with. Yeah, I think that's it. Is there any questions now?
Yeah, early on you talked about some applications work well on Hyper-V,
Mm-hmm.
some using VMware.
Yeah.
What are some of the parameters for
So Hyper-V is free if you're using the free one. If you have your volume licensing for Windows Server, then it's cheaper at least than going with VMware. VMware is kind of expensive, and it's you have to pay licensing for it. Whereas Hyper-V is a one-time, it's free, or if you're using Windows Server, one-time purchase, and then you're good to go for the life support of that product. So yeah, what I was saying is cost is one consideration. For us, the reason why we went with VMware is because we just got a digital asset management system, which is a big platform that allows us to look for and find our video assets because we're a media production company. And this particular software that we picked needed to have, they required that 3 of the 5 servers that make this thing work have direct access to the SAN storage, and Hyper-V is not capable of doing that. So that's why we had to go with this VMware. I would say that for most virtualization cases, Hyper-V is probably going to be sufficient. But once you start to get to more of the advanced features, then you may want to consider another option. So. Can you automate the creation of checkpoints? Actually, I've not done that, but I think you can. You probably would, if I were to do that, I probably would write a script to do it and then maybe just load it into Task Scheduler and have that run at designated times. It's not really something that most of the checkpoints that we're doing are because we use Veeam for our backup, and Veeam uses the checkpoint system in Hyper-V, so that's most of the checkpoints that we're doing. Yes. Yeah. Well, once the VM is running, it's just like any other server. So you can RDP into that VM, or you can use the remote administration tools. You know, it works the exact same way as it would with as a physical server. So.
Is a checkpoint? Is it like taking a full disk image when you do a checkpoint? What is it actually doing?
It's not taking a whole image. It's kind of like registering a point in time. I'm not the biggest expert on, but it's not doing like a full disk clone. That's not what it's doing. It's kind of like maybe system restore, but more advanced than that.
So
Yeah.
Is it good enough to use as a backup solution?
No. That's only for as an emergency fallback. If you're doing maintenance work, if you want to actually back up, you want something that's actually backing up those virtual machine files. Yeah.
I understand that it only checks the difference between the actual virtual hard disk and what it is in the configuration. So
Okay.
if you were to lose the virtual hard disk file, then that snapshot wouldn't do you any good.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Also, I just want to say, I ran into situations where checkpoints get corrupted.
Yes.
And you have a lot of issues. But if you want something really clean and simple, use a third-party VM backup tool like Veeam,
Yes.
Montero, something like that.
Yes.
It's a lot cleaner, a lot simpler.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Not use a snapshot until. Anyway, I just said mine. I never use it because it's not working.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, good question. Microsoft recommends no, and so I don't. Some people, I think I've read some places, they have more peace of mind doing that, but you're taking a big risk though, because if that antivirus software flags any of the virtual machine files, then you're done. So, yeah. But actually, if you have Windows Server 2016, then it comes with Windows Defender. So, you get some of those benefits, I guess. At least you have something.
You can always exclude the virtual hard disk files.
Yeah, that's an option too. Yeah, in your software. Yeah.
Is there a resource for showing you how to configure high availability?
Yeah, I like to. There's it's actually a backup company called Altero. They sell a backup solution, but they also have really good how-to resources on how to do a lot of different things with Hyper-V, best practices with Hyper-V. So I'd recommend checking them out if you want to learn more about those stuff. It's ALTARO. And of course, also the official documentation on TechNet is good too. Any other questions? Oh, sorry.
How is Linux support these days? Because I heard early on that it wasn't so great, but I've heard it's gotten better.
Yeah, I don't have a ton of experience with it. I know a colleague of mine at a different company, they use Hyper-V, and they're almost entirely a Linux shop, and it seems to be working fine for them. So I think it definitely has gotten better than the early days.
We do run
So.
a few versions of Red Hat and CentOS.
Okay, great. Okay.
Is Hyper-V clusterable like VMware as far as migrating VMs between hosts?
Yes, that would be it does have live migration since 2012. Yeah.
Is it possible to migrate from VMware over to Hyper-V without having to totally rebuild the server?
Yeah, I know VMware has a tool to let you go the other way, but I don't know if I don't know if
StarWinds has a couple of different tools.
okay. Yeah. All right.
I ran into that situation before, so what I've done is instead of trying to worry about all the settings, you really just want to create migrate the virtual hard disk itself, and then you can recreate the VM on the fly. The settings are just, that's simple. That's that. You got to no time. What's more important is that virtual that hard disk or that DMPK file. That's what you really want to migrate from the DMPK to was it DHD or DHDX?
Yeah.
One or two Hyper-V user.
Because usually you can do that quick enough to where your users don't even notice.
Yeah.
Especially if you're using Altero or Altero backup, you can just restore and use that.
Mhm.
Or, I mean, it takes no time to do it. I mean, you can delete and recreate this stuff on the fly. And during lunchtime, like I said, you can just say, hey, we'll be down for an hour. You can redo it in no time and put it on the size of your hard drive.
Hey. Any other questions? All right. I think that's it. Thank you so much, guys.